sometimes it really is the ones you most expect. Yes, I know CoffeeZilla basically made a video with that title, but it really does apply here. Because in a shocking twist, the internet grifter who promised to sell you a secret list of get-rich-quick tricks has been charged with fraud by the Securities and Exchange Commission. Though it is actually kind of a twist because I didn't know that enforcement agencies in the federal government were actually enforcing laws against anyone who isn't a political enemy of this administration at this time. But I guess there must be still one or two unfired employees with functional ethical compasses over at the SEC, because on September 25th, 2025, the agency charged Tai Lopez and Alex Mayer, co-founders of Retail E-Commerce Ventures, REV, and its chief operating officer, Maya Birkenrode, with making fraudulent securities offerings, misusing investor funds, and engaging in a Ponzi scheme. Though this probably came as no surprise to any reasonable observer of Tai's so-called media empire. Though like a lot of online grifters, Tai Lopez's origin story is a little fuzzy. There's no Wikipedia page explaining his background, and nothing on his website listing any actual qualifications beyond his number of social media followers and the amount of money he claims to have made. But despite lacking any apparent qualifications, he promised that his advice about life was worth paying an unspecified amount of money. Lopez's earliest claim to fame, and probably where you saw him for the first time, appears to be a 2015 ad called Here in My Garage, where Lopez hawked the Lamborghini that he putatively paid for.
Here in my garage, just bought this new Lamborghini here. But you know what I like a lot more than materialistic things? Knowledge.
Now, Lopez claimed that this ad brought him in somewhere between $75 and $100 million, though it's a little unclear exactly how that ad translated to those profits or revenue or have any bearing on reality.
Phase 1, collect underpants. Phase 2, Phase 3, profit.
But Lopez followed that up with a TEDx talk where he dispensed the groundbreaking advice that people should read books and find a mentor. He managed to leverage these thin credentials into an online business where he sold his 67 Steps to Success program, books, and podcast appearances. He touted advice on everything from business investments to body fat to dating. Now, we'd like to show you some of his YouTube videos, but everything on his channel has mysteriously disappeared. Can you smell that? That smells like spoliation of evidence. But I guess we'll just have to settle for Instagram.
If you want to make 10x your money, or even 100x your money, find something in the world everybody needs, nobody can stop, and few people understand.
Like, we live in the best time ever to make money. Look at ideas like this perfume one. Like, stop overthinking it. Go launch a new stream of income. Forget paralysis by overanalysis. The world is yours, my friend.
Bezos has a saying, if you have a 10% chance of making a lot of money, you should do it, even if you have a 90% chance of failure.
But we'll check back in a few minutes to see how those 10% odds are treating you, Tai. But apparently all this looked legit enough to inspire a bunch of people to invest with Lopez and his partners on his latest business venture, buying up dead brick-and-mortar stores and then resurrecting them as e-commerce businesses. Which in and of itself could totally be a legitimate business and certainly is far from the scammiest thing that Lopez has ever done, but it looks like Tai Lopez found a way to make it scammy. In 2019, Tai and his business partner, Alex Mayer, founded Retail E-Commerce Ventures, or REV, which purchased a series of dead mall brands like Radio Shack, Dress Barn, Modell's Sporting Goods, and Pier 1 Imports for rock-bottom prices. The theory was that these companies still had enough brand recognition to be zombified into profit-making e-commerce businesses. But in order to buy the husks of these companies, Lopez and Mayer needed to raise money. Luckily, Lopez had a ready supply of suckers.
There's a saying, if you're in a room and you don't know who the sucker is, you're the sucker. You never want to be the sucker.
I mean investors, on hand from his 67 Steps email list. Because allegedly between April 2020 and November 2022, Lopez and Mayer managed to raise a whopping $112 million from hundreds of different investors. Now, when these investors signed on, they were allegedly given letters of intent. These letters spelled out the terms of the investment, including what specifically the person was investing in. Now, Lopez and Mayer told investors that they had two choices. They could put money into REV, the parent company, which would give them an indirect share of all the smaller companies REV owned, or they could invest directly into one or more of those smaller companies, including any of REV's 8 retail brands. So apparently investors who chose a specific company were promised that their money would be used to acquire that specific company. And in exchange for their money, investors were promised outrageous payoffs. Lopez and Mayer told investors that they would get a full return on their investment and could earn up to 25% per year, and they would also get a monthly payment of 2.08%. Lopez and Mayer explained to investors that they could earn such high returns because REV, quote, acquired the businesses so cheaply. Remember, kids, if something sounds too good to be true, It definitely is. Also, never invest with Tai Lopez. Because the truth was that the e-commerce model wasn't working and these companies never generated a profit. The government alleges from October 2021 to October 2022, Rev and its brands incurred monthly net losses ranging from $3.8 million to $12 million. While some of the companies generated revenue, not a single one turned a profit. Things got so desperate that Radio Shack, the home of ham radio nerds and high school AV geeks, suddenly morphed into a cryptocurrency platform with a bizarrely offensive Twitter presence. But worse, apparently Lopez and Mayer continued to report to investors that companies like Dress Barn and Steinmart were, quote, on fire and, quote, the cash flow is strong. Apparently in online and in-person meetings, they pitched new investments by touting the success of previous ventures. They claimed, for example, that Dress Barn, one of Rev's earliest acquisitions, had helped to raise funds for later acquisitions. In reality, Dress Barn lost nearly $13.7 million in 2020 and $10.7 million in 2021. And Steinmart lost nearly $1.7 million in 2020 and $5.7 million in 2021. But Lopez and Mayer also claimed that Rev never missed a payment to a single investor, and apparently this too was a lie. From early 2022, investors began claiming that the company had failed to make the promised payments. Investors described being ghosted or even sent screenshots of entirely made-up bank transfers.
And, it got to a point where she sent me a screenshot. Hey, the wire got sent out. And I'm like, okay, well, if I got a screenshot of a wire and then I didn't get the wire, of course. And then I got ghosted for about a month.
And as Rev and his companies got further and further into debt, it became more and more difficult to make the promised payments to investors. So it seems in a desperate attempt to stave off accountability for their failed business enterprise and false promises, Lopez and Mayer turned to outside lenders, cash advances, and finally, just a straight-out Ponzi scheme. Now let's talk for a minute about Ponzi schemes, because it's actually pretty instructive here. Now, as you probably know, a Ponzi scheme is a type of investment fraud where investors are promised artificially high rates of return with little or no risk. And the early investors and the perpetrators of the fraud are paid off with funds by later investors. Early investors are made to think, though, that the payoffs are coming from legitimate business revenue. But the thing about Ponzi schemes is that they have to grow continuously or they'll fail immediately. Otherwise, payments to early investors will stop, those investors will catch on, and the entire scheme will fall apart. So the fraud perpetrator has to work constantly to add new investors to prop up the old scheme. And sometimes the early investors will be paid a large amount and told that the high interest rates are coming in, and therefore they invest yet more money into the Ponzi scheme. And sometimes the defrauded investors themselves are so impressed by their initial but fake returns that they spread the scheme to their friends and family, inadvertently helping the fraud to grow. Now, Ponzi schemes are named after a fraudster in the 1920s named Charles Ponzi, who defrauded thousands of investors in Boston. Ponzi promised investors a 50% profit within 45 days or 100% profit within 90 days by buying discounted foreign postal reply coupons and redeeming them at face value in the US as a form of arbitrage. Instead, though, he was paying early investors and himself with money from later investors. At his peak, Ponzi was pulling in $250,000 per day in the 1920s. His scheme ultimately cost investors $20 million, which is the equivalent of $314 million in today's money. But Ponzi was indicted with 86 counts of federal mail fraud, though he pled guilty and only ended up serving 3.5 years in jail. And when he was released, he was surprised to find himself facing another 22 state charges of larceny. And that's where he made his second historical impression on the US legal system. His case went all the way to the Supreme Court, where in Ponzi versus Fessenden, the justices ruled that federal plea bargains don't trigger double jeopardy when a state files its own charges. Now, back to Lopez, experts say that there are often a list of red flags that often indicate a Ponzi scheme. And a lot of these sound very similar to the details of what Tai Lopez was doing. High returns with little or no risk, overly consistent returns, investments that aren't registered with the SEC or state regulators, unlicensed sellers, secretive complex strategies, issues with paperwork, and difficulty receiving payments. Now, the SEC certainly saw some red flags because they launched an investigation into Lopez and Mayer, and on September 25th, 2025, announced that they were charging both men and Rev President and COO Maya Birkenrode with a long list of fraud charges. But speaking of wiping your information, if you're not currently under federal investigation, it's probably a good time to wipe all of your personal and private information off the internet. Because your cell phone number, home address, email address, private social media accounts, and tons of sensitive data are shockingly easy to purchase by anybody online. But you can fight back and take control of your private information by signing up for today's sponsor, Incogni. Because Incogni wipes your personal data from the internet by searching the internet, reaching out to data brokers and websites directly on your behalf, and forcing them to remove your private information. If they resist, Incogni will take care of that too, because Incogni fights back. But what makes Incogni truly powerful in taking back control of your privacy is their custom removals feature. It allows you to flag an unlimited number of sites where your data is exposed, and you can even have Incogni's privacy experts review and tackle the most uncooperative data brokers and people search sites. I've been using Incogni personally for years now, and in that time, you can see I've been on hundreds of lists, some of which had a high sensitivity score, meaning the broker had tons of data on me. Luckily, Incogni has completed hundreds of takedowns in that time. I could never do this myself, so thank you to Incogni for weeks worth of work in adding me to over 40 suppression lists. And Incogni will continue to conduct ongoing removals because even if the broker removes your data once, they can collect it and publish it again. So if online privacy is important to you, give Incogni a try. If you scan the code on screen or click on the link in the description, you'll get 60% off their annual unlimited plan. And you can also try Incogni risk-free for 30 days. If you decide you want to keep it, you'll still get the 60% off discount so long as you use my code LegalEagle, all one word. So sign up for Incogni or I'll see you in court. In the SEC's complaint, the agency charged Lopez and Mayer with 6 counts of fraud and Birkenrode with 5 counts. And Lopez and Mayer were charged with fraud under Section 17A1, 2, and 3 of the Securities Act. That section prohibits security sellers from employing any device, scheme, or artifice to defraud or obtain money or property by means of any untrue statement of material fact or any omission to state a material fact necessary in order to make the statements made in light of the circumstances under which they were made, not misleading or engaging in any transaction, practice, or course of business which operates or would operate as a fraud or deceit upon the purchaser. They were also charged with fraud under good old sections 10b and 10b-5 of the Exchange Act. Section 10b prohibits security sellers from engaging in, quote, any manipulative or deceptive device or contrivance in contravention of such rules and regulations as the Commission may prescribe as necessary or appropriate in the public interest or for the protection of investors. And Rule 10b-5 is pretty similar. Now, since Section 17a parallels Rule 10b-5, the analysis for these rules is all pretty similar except for the mens rea requirements, which we'll get to, but the underlying rule here is do not lie to your investors. That will get you in trouble. But the agency is alleging that Lopez, Mayer, and Birkenrode engaged in several legally fraudulent actions. First, the agency alleges that they made a series of misleading statements to investors when they said that the companies were on fire and cash flow was strong to potential investors. Those were outright lies. The SEC alleges that Lopez and Mayer both had every reason to know that the companies were failing to generate profits and were actually incurring serious losses. And when they knew that, they were legally obligated to report those honestly to investors. The three of them also misrepresented Birkenrode's background on Rev's website. As the chief operating officer responsible for a portfolio worth more than $100 million, investors would reasonably expect her to have some relevant experience. And the website indicated that she had, quote, over 10 years of experience managing multi-million-dollar companies. This, though, was not true. Before working as Rev's president and COO, Birkenrode had worked as a substitute preschool teacher, a promoter at a radio station, and an assistant to her cousin Tai in his online education company. Even more seriously, it looks like the three of them misappropriated millions of dollars of funds. They told investors that their investments would go toward the acquisition and basic operating cost of a particular company, but instead it looks like they used that money from one company to prop up another pretty much continuously. They appear to have commingled funds extensively across companies without ever telling investors that was what they were doing, and it looks like they were actively engaging in a Ponzi scheme when they started using one investor's money to pay the others. According to the SEC, quote, from July 2022 to October 2022 alone, defendants directed at least $5.9 million in new investor funds to be used to pay returns to early investors in classic Ponzi-like fashion. And probably worst of all, it looks like Lopez and Mayer stole millions of dollars of investor funds to line their own pockets. Lopez and Mayer are alleged to have misappropriated $12.5 million and $3.6 million respectively by diverting investor funds to their personal accounts, owned or controlled by them for no apparent business purpose. And the elements of these charges are all pretty similar. First, the SEC will need to show that Lopez, Mayer, and Birkenrode misrepresented one or more material facts. Second, that those investors relied on those misstatements. And third, that the investors were harmed because of that. Now, there is one key difference between the two laws, the mens rea or intent requirement. Section 17A of the Securities Act has a lower mens rea standard than Rule 10b-5. Under Section 17A, the SEC will only need to prove that Lopez, Mayer, and Birkenrode acted negligently. Under Rule 10b-5 and the other sections, the agency has to show that they acted knowingly or at least recklessly. And of course, the agency is claiming that all of the above representations were material. That is, that they would have made a difference to a reasonable investor as they considered whether or not to invest the money. As the Supreme Court put it in TSC Industries versus Northway, quote, there must be a substantial likelihood that the disclosure of the omitted fact would have been viewed by the reasonable investor as having significantly altered the total mix of information made available. That should probably not be very difficult here. A reasonable investor might hesitate to invest if they knew that the company was being managed by someone whose most recent credential was being a substitute preschool teacher. No shade to preschool teachers, but that job experience might not qualify them for this particular job managing, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of investments. And perhaps even more obviously, if your companies are ruinously unprofitable, it makes it more likely that an investor will not invest money with you. And the SEC has offered many examples of investors who relied on these statements, including one who reported a May 2022 investor Zoom call where Lopez claimed that, quote, Rev never missed a cash payment or preferred payment since inception. And props to YouTuber CoffeeZilla, who even interviewed one of Lopez's investors and obviously relied on Lopez and Mayor's profit promises when he decided to invest.
I mean, the deal was great. It was, 20% returns on your money for 2 years. And then there was supposed to be a return of capital after 2 years and a balloon payment of 40% paid with your principal returned. And so, I threw in, I think it was like $275,000 or something like that.
Definitely check out the rest of CoffeeZilla's video after you finish this one. But the agency calculated that the total investor loss that resulted from Lopez, Mayer, and Birkenrode's fraud was $122 million. Though it can always be difficult to deal with the heightened mens rea requirements of some of these securities rules. For example, under Rule 10b-5, the agency has to prove that the defendants made these misrepresentations knowingly or at least recklessly. They couldn't just be negligent with their accounting, they had to actually know that the statements were false. But the agency did include lots of facts in its complaint that will lay the groundwork for this. For instance, the income statements for the companies, which prove that they were losing a lot of money, which the defendants would have had access to. The SEC also claims that, quote, during several internal Rev meetings in mid-2022, Tai and Alex discussed the overall financial situation with Maya, as well as the need to raise additional capital and having to prioritize vendor payments and triage investor payments. And according to the SEC, Rev's head bookkeeper also prepared a weekly spreadsheet that he shared with Birkenrode. This spreadsheet detailed bank account balances, expenses, and other cash outflows, including investor payments owed and shortfalls for each of the companies. Birkenrode then apparently shared this with Lopez and Mayer, and the three of them would apparently then determine where to pull the funds to cover any shortfalls. The agency alleges that the bookkeeper then executed transfers based on Birkenrode's instructions. For example, when a large number of investor notes were coming due in 2022, Birkenrode told him how to cover the shortfalls by directing what amounts to take from which bank accounts. But apparently even this level of fraud still isn't enough to turn off some of the true believers. Jared, the investor that CoffeeZilla interviewed, who lost about $275,000, has said that, quote, I actually still do business with them because they're not bad dudes. They freaking hurt themselves more than anybody. And Tai himself is still hoping for intervention from a higher power.
This universe took, but it can also just give back. Donald Trump calls you, it's over. You're pardoned.
And I hate to say this, Tai, but if history with past fraudsters is any indication, if you make the right political donations, a higher power might grant you a pardon. But if you or a loved one has been harmed by Tai Lopez, you might be entitled to compensation. Luckily, I know a guy. Now, after I started this channel, every week I'd get hundreds of comments and emails from viewers who are dealing with legal problems. And they'd ask, can you help me find a lawyer? How do I know if this attorney is any good? And there's a massive gap in our justice system. It's that people don't know how to find the right lawyer for their specific situation. They're scared, they're overwhelmed, and they end up doing nothing or hiring the first attorney who calls them back. And that really bothered me. So I started to wonder, what if there was a different way? What if we could build a law firm that actually lived up to the values that I talk about on this channel? Transparency, accessibility, and putting clients first instead of chasing billable hours. A firm where you don't need to pay anything up front and your lawyers only get paid if you do to maximize your opportunity for justice. So a few years ago, I decided to fix that problem. I decided to start my own personal injury law firm. And honestly, it wasn't an easy choice. But I realized I was in this unique position. I had this platform, this community, and the experience. Not to get rich, trust me, there are easier ways to make money than starting a law practice. But we did it because access to justice shouldn't be a luxury. Because finding the right legal representation shouldn't feel like playing Russian roulette with your future. And when you work with my firm, you're not just getting a lawyer. You're getting a team that understands that behind every case is a real person with real stakes. If we can't represent you or you're in a state where we don't practice, we'll take the time to try to match you with an attorney in my personal network of lawyers. A national network of some of the best lawyers in the country who actually specialize in what you're going through, located right where you are, not just whoever happens to be available. So if you're dealing with a personal injury, a car crash, a data breach, sexual harassment, a social security or workers' comp issue, give us a call at the number on screen or click on the link below. Now, I can't represent everyone that watches this channel. I wish I could, but what I can do is make sure that when you need legal help, you have somewhere to turn to that you can trust. So whether it's me handling your case or the incredible attorneys we partnered with, you'll get the same principles of honesty and education that we bring to every video. And if you're dealing with a legal issue and you're not sure where to start, check out the link in the description. Let's have a conversation about how we can help you find not just a lawyer, but the right lawyer for your situation. Because at the end of the day, that's what this is all about, making sure that when life gets complicated, you don't have to face it alone. Which is why when you need a lawyer, you don't just need a legal team, you need the Eagle team.